Okay, this lesson for the Cornet Project class asked the question, why we won't know where do we begin. I recall things in my life around the church. That is, I grew up early in life in a New Testament church, unashamedly identifying itself all the way back to the days of Christ, and it was good to hear them say things. Now I know a little better, but they talk about the seashores of Galilee and him calling people to come out, and I know it's a little earlier than that, but that's the things you recall, and I'd never heard of. Honestly, I'd never, as a child, sat in the assembly and heard the preacher have to stop and identify which Bible he might be reading from. None of us had any other kind. And to date, I believe in the American Baptist Association, they still quote from or use and cite and quote from in the design curriculum for Sunday schools. They still quote from a Schofield reference, King James edition. So, but I remember when no one would ever have said that. We didn't know. And when I first heard about King James translation, I thought he translated it. And so I would have known where to begin with that. And it's just like I'm asked today things that I still don't know where to begin. I mean, I know a little bit more where to begin, but for example, Calvinism, when I was accused incessantly by people who would say it, I realized not only do they not know what are they talking about, but it was just a charged word, somewhat like what we dealt with and helped young people in high school and then in university and colleges, because some people can't take labels, and then what people who charge labels with, it's not always a positive energy. So I learned as a social scientist, they were just doing it for social currency. What could they gain by diminishing someone? So as I was accused, I noticed that they don't have any idea what they're talking about. Recently, I was reminded someone wrote in a reply, and they were saying something about how pathetic it was what I was saying, and referring to John Calvin as the founder of the Reformation. Well, they didn't know Martin Luther was the one who initiated the Protestant Reformation, October 31st, 1517. I only remember that date because it's the number of my P.O. box, 1517. And that was quite appropriate because it gave me a way to remember that and also to use it as a conversation. So the person didn't even know the origin of the Protestant Reformation. They certainly don't know that Lutherans don't agree with Calvinists. The unsurpassed highest Calvinist is scholastic and in competency and aptitude in defending that which is historically known. Dr. James White has written things that show errors in Lutheranism that are irreparable. They can't be repaired. So there's quite a friction there between, and yet this person was so anxious to be vitriolic, diminishing, and to cast derision that he was blinded by that emotion. So when we talk about Calvinism, let's just see the word there, Calvinism, and he didn't really have that much to do with what we think of it today as King James did with the King James Bible. King James, what we say, commissioned that work to be done. But here, this actually came into existence long after this man was gone. I'm certain he would not appreciate things people say in his name today. And again, even reference the unsurpassed Dr. James R. White. He openly refers to fallible features and errors within John Calvin's writings. But we all know that John Calvin couldn't do a meta-analysis on his computer and do a word search through thousands of pages of documents in just a few moments like we do today. So I don't know if anyone out there historically has a large body of work that now that it becomes online in an e-format, that any of us couldn't just sift it and totally deconstruct it. So I was curious most people don't know what it is. I know the most humiliating moment in my life was in a class called The Psychology of Religion. And what was most humiliating, and it never happened, not in any class I'd ever taken, not even in calculus, which I thought that was difficult enough. So then I took something called critical thinking, which was the most difficult undergraduate course I'd ever taken. And that's, with all due respect, that is it really challenges your mind. So I was sitting there and realizing that the question that was asked was, how do you define religion? Well, I jumped right in, fell for it. I thought, well, that's easy. Well, come to find out, it's not so easy. Matter of fact, I'll place a link in there in the description to show how difficult that is. But how do you define this? Well, at blueletterbible.org, Calvinism defined. Calvinism is the name given to a system of theology that was developed from the writings of the Protestant reformer John Calvin. And it says he lived in the 16th century. So it says that he developed the teachings of the ancient church theologian Augustine. So as you notice, when you get to Calvin, they did what all do in doing research. What's the root from which this fruit Calvinism originated? So let's just start there. How do you define it? I mean the thing, not the define it. Well, Blue Letter Bible, a system of theology. And then, of course, B, let's say origin. They mentioned Augustine. So there we go. Well, then, of course, now that we have a system of theology, we have origin, then back to define it as we work to do here is we included something that seemed to be more, it seemed to incite more emotion or willingness to emote. We're learning now as social scientists, I just fascinated with it. People lash out. I mean, if you just totally do away with all the constructs, all the systems of theology, and you start from scratch, which is okay, those systems of theology won't evaporate just because you choose not to avail yourself of them. The mental models, for example, that Calvinism is for a lot of people, which are designed to be scaffolding to go and learn from, or to review and revise it. But you really can't improve it because then it's no longer that which it presents itself to be. So you leave your scaffolding alone, I suppose, is somewhat what they do. So define it. We've been saying very clearly a fallible religious construct. And then words that were just used, it's a mental model. And then we'll just end here. This fallible religious construct, this mental model, it when we define it, we have to then ask, how did we analyze and evaluate just to get here? So we now know it's fallible. We know it's a religious construct. We know it's a mental model. We know it's intended. We have to know how to analyze and evaluate. But it's certainly been fascinating because I wasn't expecting. We began, this is the Koine Project class, and I had no idea out there in the World Wide Web and all the platforms that there were so few people that actually study what it is that we consider so personal. I mean, you can't offend anyone unless you know John Calvin, but I don't think he's here. Augustine and Calvin both long dead. So I'm not certain, except it becomes an identity. And this is why if you begin to break it down, let's go over here, number 3, as you evaluate it, you want to evaluate something fallible against that which is infallible. And that's why in this class we use our English Bible, the last Bible of its kind, the one that King James wouldn't approve of if he were here, because it's definitely gone through much refinement that was necessary, and it warranted to have the best form of it for the common man out there for whom it was intended and on whose behalf it serves. So you can read the history of the Baptist and go to logos.com, where they have online, they'll tell you about the difficulties in finding an E version of the King James Bible, and you can read about Cambridge University, the Baptist who catalyzed Cambridge to make the necessary improvements, refinements, as I would like to say. So here we'll compare it. Remember, it's a construct, so we'll compare it with, evaluate it with the English Bible. And that's really the closest thing anyone will ever have as far as holding in your hand a body of material that would be a standard that we would absolutely state as infallible. I have noticed something as a social scientist, very interesting. People seem to be more personally incited if you question and remind them that Calvinism, the fallible religious construct, is fallible. It's fallible. Then, but some seem just bent on deconstructing the King James, as it's now called, but the Bible, the English Bible. And they seem to have even thinking it more irrational to prefer the English Bible over this construct. And yet Dr. Robert Morey, the late Dr. Robert Morey, was really giving people a hard time who were trying to find some type of what we call interdependence and maybe correlatives between the major Protestant systems of theology, the Calvin, the Luther, the Arminius, the Molina, the Pelagian, whatever all that is. Anyway, they were, and he was saying something against people who are trying to be Calminians. And I thought, well, that's strange, because they're making an effort to see where these things might correlate, complement, where they might enrich our understanding or improve it. But then in the next minute, you hear someone that might be like that, a Calvinist only, ridiculing someone for being King James only. So let me write this here just to make sure I don't forget to tell you all this. But Calvinism ain't the Bible. And if you ever read any good confessions, they'll tell you that only the Bible is infallible. So I see it much more rational for a person like myself as a process control specialist. I didn't want variables. So we in this class have been agreed that we'll use our English Bible, the King James as it's still called, but it bears very little relation to, he wouldn't have approved it because it's been improved, it's been refined as it was worthy of being done, and people who used it for the rule of faith and practice. The Baptists, for example, catalyzed Cambridge with so much feedback that they were very careful by 1873 to really place some footnotes, show what they were doing, and were very careful to indicate. So if you think it irrational to have a standard, but I don't know, I've heard people say that some have said the Hebrew and the Greek, you don't need that or whatever. I don't really know that many people that could use it. And that means they didn't want to ever acquire the ability. But so many fewer people are even aware of Koine Greek or Biblical Hebrew. And then even less, or even more or less interested in how to master it, or at least acquire a knowledge of its use, you see. So if you do evaluate with the English Bible, you can do that. And then, of course, the fourth thing is you want to, in light of holism, you'll notice some of the parts that are missing, omissive errors. You'll notice, well, let's just say this. You'll define, document, and then disclose, let's just say, fallible features. Well, fallible elements, it fits the board. Fallible elements. Now that, for some reason, I don't know why that bothers people. If you don't want to evaluate your own Calvinism, that is, if you've appropriated this construct and you're Calvinism only, okay, so I don't really know what that means. You may have less interest demonstrably in Calvinism that you are defending emotionally than those of us who evaluate it academically and contrast it with the Bible. So the next thing you will do is notice formed categories. Things that we might say, let's say, for example, total hereditary depravity. You'll hear people really defend it, but first thing you'll notice when you actually do evaluation is there's not a consensus on what term depravity derives. And that's fascinating because I had used the word so often that I thought it was in the English Bible. It's not in the English Bible. And I've heard people ridicule the use of the word rapture, and the next breath they're using the word depravity. You'll find sovereignty, that's a Latin term. So when you start noticing formed categories, those aren't inspired categories. Those aren't Bible words. And when I say Bible words, I mean you really can't find the word depravity in the English Bible. And that's the only Bible I know. So I was just saying this is why at times we won't know how to answer this. Where do we begin? Because there's so much energy for King James only and then energy for anti-King James only, which ironically can be by people who are Calvinism only. And so it's none of us are really that familiar with our own, let's say, primers and then our drivers, if you will. What really drives us and compels us. And you can pull triggers when you do research, and that's why we work and collaborate. We use collaborative reasoning, collective learning process. We focus on the cognitive, not the emotive. So we'll conclude there. But we have to remember when we sit down and do this, against what was Calvinism formed in the first place? Well, it was, I'll just say this, it was anti-Arminianism. And one thing I enjoyed about that, it was that people had a lot of energy in the area I was in to point out the faults, if you will. They were really all too happy to define, document, and disclose fallible elements. Within Arminianism and Molinism, Lutheranism, Pelagianism, again, I won't live long enough, thankfully, to have to go sift through all those things. But it is fascinating because it was so helpful. And like I said, I was accused of being a Calvinist by every flavor of Arminian when I came out, but I had no idea what that meant. I just thought that's fascinating. So I get to the faith of the missionary Baptist churches, specifically in the American Baptist Association, and they're very adamant, even have books, neither Calvinist nor Arminian. Of course, if you knew the history of John Calvin and his persecution of people identified as Baptists, you could study also what Luther did to people. I think he was in, well, there's just a lot of atrocities there. Again, that was before our time, but Calvinism was a defense, or let's say a rebuttal, if you will, to Arminianism. I didn't know that. And you'll learn about Dortian, I think is the word they use, the canons of Dort, which I wouldn't have known what any of that was. So I'm just saying that this is why sometimes we don't know what we're talking about. But I still stumble a little sometimes, taken aback in such a civil society we're in. Maybe I need to take a new view of that, because it appears that our feedback is showing people have already drawn their conclusions and have never engaged in a process that led to those conclusions. For example, total, and then hereditary, and then depravity. Well, this is a conclusion of, let's say, I've been in a few math classes. I was so impressed with calculus and even the trigonometry professors where I was. Sometimes they would, in calculus especially, you would be 2 or 3 whiteboards. They're still writing out a problem. But if you walked in and there was just simply the answer, total hereditary depravity, but there was nothing on the board that took you there, this is what we're now realizing is becoming concretized, is that people take the word or phrase, whatever this superordinate category, total hereditary depravity, and they think it's a binary statement. Are you for it or against it? And I'm like, you can't even express it. You can't elucidate it. You don't understand it. You have no appreciation for it. I mean, it's similar to, why we prefer certain art. I mean, if we can't see in it something we like, some people like to see landscapes and some people like portraits and whatever. It's just then when you get to abstract or modern expressions, some people have no appreciation for it. So they even have classes that we know of for decades now called art appreciation. And anytime you take a class that has the word appreciation, you'll be exposed and asked to think and research and write and then be tested and take exams, write essays on things that, unless you were compelled because you needed that to meet a requirement for your major, you would never have appreciated. Matter of fact, it was ironic to me how much I learned to not appreciate things that were somewhat coerced, if you will, so I might appreciate it. So this is why we might not know where to begin, because it's really hard to define it. I mean, you even look at the word system, you'll find out that's a very substantial term. Go back to Augustine. I've never done that. So when you define these things and you begin to look at it, you'll notice things have come out that we're all kind of walking contradictions, because I'm still amazed as a social scientist to watch so much vitriol against people, King James only, even to the point of saying they're cultish, which there could be, a sector out there in the 360-degree unit circle. There could be someone that's, I guess, made it cultish. But, if you said that about Calvinism or Lutheranism or Arminianism or Molinism or Pelagianism or those who follow Ussher, the chronographer, I guess, wrote about chronologies. I guess you could always, slander, defame. It's like ad hominem. You could start, saying that. I guess if you if you don't have really a good understanding or grasp what you're talking about. But this is interesting because the formed categories really surprised me. I'm still not resolved in my own mind, and I haven't recovered in my being, if you will, on how many things I had once thought were in the Bible. And I remember as a young fellow that I saw wedding ceremonies and the preachers holding a Bible. So it was later in life I asked my father, I said, so I can't find the wedding ceremony in the Bible. And I'm holding my English Bible, and of course it's the only one we had. I still never understood that. But so I'm holding my Bible, and he says, that's not in the Bible. So I would look for, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God in the presence of these witnesses for the purpose of joining this man, this woman in the bonds of holy matrimony. And I just thought, wow, I don't know why. And I didn't have a thumb index. So I was always thinking, if I just had a thumb index, I could get through there. But my naivete was dispelled, and the things like that. Oh, misspelled construct. Let's be careful. So we found a fallible element there. Omissive error. We need to remember those. Errors of omission. Errors of omission. And I may have misspelled that. I think that has another one. So that's enough of that, but it makes things a little easier. Those of you that would like to take a more efficient, that is more effective with better efficiency in communicating. I have noticed something I didn't expect as a social scientist. I've noticed there are people who would have preferred that some of us not evaluate Calvinism according to the tools and according to the holistic approach. It's almost as if they would wish we would just be red-faced, raise our voices, but we're not here to do that. We can't learn by doing that. So collaborative reasoning, collective learning, and this is why we might not know where do we begin. So you have a blessed day and enjoy this lesson.